folks, and welcome to another episode of Chapters. We are doing things just a little bit differently in these days of the coronavirus. We are not at the Inner Geek, and I am not at the beach, although I wish I were. And our guest today, Savannah Sipple, is coming to us from her home. So we have recorded this and hope that it all goes well. Chapters is the program that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in the tri-state region around Huntington, West Virginia. That means Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia. I'm your host, Carter Seaton, and it's good to be here, even if it is virtually. With us today is, as I said, Savannah Sipple, and she is from Lexington, Kentucky. She's the author of WWJD and Other Poems, which explores what it is to be a queer woman in Appalachia and is rooted in its culture and in her body. Her writing has recently been published in Southern Cultures, Split This Rock, Salon, Appalachian Heritage, Waxwing, and other places. She's also an assistant professor of English at Bluegrass Community and Technical College and a mentor in the low residency MFA program at West Virginia Wesleyan College. Welcome to Chapters virtually.
Thank you, Carter. It's good to be able to talk with you. If not in person, at least we have the technology to meet online.
That's right. That's remarkable. And I'm sure things have been different for you in your teaching because you're having to do that online as well.
Yeah, it's been an adjustment. I do have a fair amount of experience teaching classes that are fully online, but it's different when the class starts out in person and you have to move it online.
Yes.
I was lucky enough that I had time to, first of all, my in-person classes had an online component, and so my students would submit their papers in Blackboard. But then I also had time to go over a few things with them in the class session right before we decided to move everything. And so it's been an experience, but I'm lucky that I've taught online before.
Right.
So
yeah,
we're doing the best we can.
All right. Well, let's talk about your book, and that will make things a little more interesting so we don't have to stop and think all day long about the coronavirus.
Okay.
You grew up in Eastern Kentucky. Where was that exactly? And can you tell us about your life growing up?
I grew up in a little town called Beattyville. It's close to Red River Gorge. It's a little bit further southeast than the gorge, and it's a small little town. I think there were 71 or 79 students in my graduating class. When I was growing up, there were 2 elementary schools, a middle school and a high school. And now there's only 1 elementary school. And I lived in a little holler called Bear Track for the first 15 years of my life. And so we lived basically in the middle of the woods. And our closest neighbor was, I think, a half a mile or quarter mile away. So we gardened, and I grew up there, and the people I was friends with there, most of them I grew up with since I was a kid, like real young, and left when I went to college and came back for a few years and then left again. So.
Mm-hmm. When you were growing up, was your family evangelical? Were they very much involved in the church?
They were. It's funny because we went to church every Sunday. We weren't as strictly devout as a lot of people I knew. Mm-hmm. And I went through probably a more devout phase as a teenager. And I think there were probably a lot of reasons for that. I think I wanted a place to belong, for one. But I mean, there were a lot about the church community and the church culture. There are a lot of positive things about it. And so, yeah, my closest friends, we went to the same church. Some of them, and then there were a couple of them that went to different churches, but pretty much everyone was involved in church one way or another.
Mm-hmm. And did that impact the decision as to when you came out as gay?
Oh yes, definitely. Because even having a family my family I wouldn't say was strictly religious. Church was important, but I didn't come out until I was almost 30.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it had to do with growing up and being taught that certain things were wrong and certain things were unacceptable, but then also seeing the way that people who were LGBTQ or rumored to be LGBTQ, how they were treated. And not even just by the church, but just in general. Like, I saw the way people were treated at school if they were rumored to be gay or whatever else. Very few people when I was growing up were out in school. There were people who got talked about and accused of being gay and got bullied horribly for, supposed things they were or were not. And, people were bullied not just for being homosexual or anything else. But religion itself had a lot to do with why I didn't come out. I think for a long time, it was hard for me to come to the realization that I was probably gay. And then once I realized I had just sort of decided that I wouldn't act on it, and I would focus on work, and I would be a great auntie, and I would be fine. But it eats away at you when you have a secret like that.
Yes.
And so part of why I left again had to do with I just needed to find a way to come out. And I knew that I wouldn't find that way while I was still living there.
I see. So tell us about the book that you've written. And the subject matter is obviously a lot about being gay in Appalachia, about bullying, about body shaming, all of those issues that people maybe in the same situation you were in grapple with.
Yeah, so the book is a collection of poetry, and it's basically divided into 3 parts. And like the first section, I tell people is sort of like the being in the closet section and trying to pass, trying to be something that you're not, and coming to terms with that. And then the second section is more of like the coming out and trying to figure out how to be okay with that. And then the third part is being out and also sort of wrestling with some of those religious issues. And religion is a theme that runs throughout the book. And there are poems that talk about bullying. And it also talks about the ways that, like, violence is a huge theme in the book, and the ways that violence is perpetuated, and how not only just being bullied, but how people who are bullied also bully. And so there's a lot of different components that run through it. A lot of it also deals with being female, and some of the obstacles I encountered with that. But it wrestles with this idea at its core of how would Jesus react to this? Because I do think because religion played such a role in my ability or inability to come out, I mean, a huge part of what I had to think about was, what are the core of my beliefs? What's the foundation for my beliefs? And does my being gay change that? And so that's what I try to tackle in the book.
Do you think, people wear that bracelet that says WWJD, what would Jesus do? Have you ever taken any flack for using that in the context in which you use it? I think it's a brilliant device for this book because it does wrestle with those 2 issues of how somebody deals with the life situation they find themselves in.
Yeah, I I am sure that I've probably received some criticism for it. I have never had anyone say anything to me, which, I'm sure someone could at some point. There's this concept of what would Jesus do? And when I was growing up, like, that was a phrase that was used, and you were supposed to think about it before you, I don't know, made decisions about certain things, or when you felt tempted about certain things. And so what I wanted to do was look at, like, how would Jesus react to this? How would he treat this person? And by this person, mostly me, like, how would he treat me? And I've spent parts of my life hurting myself in various ways, and even just hurting myself by not being honest about who I really am. And for whatever reason I did that. He wouldn't want that.
Right.
And I believe that. And so I understand if people have some criticism about it. No one's expressed that to me, but I really wanted to really look deeply at that.
Well, I personally think it's a great title.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
We do. How long did it take you to put this collection together, and were these poems in other publications before you created the book?
Yeah, I started writing a book where I wanted to talk about these issues in Appalachia, but it was a book of persona poems, and so I wanted to write about them, but I really didn't want to, like, focus on my story. And I had a mentor tell me, you have a lot of strengths and a lot of good work here, but you're missing. Like, you are missing in these poems, and it's creating distance between the manuscript and the reader. And so I took that manuscript and scrapped a huge chunk of it, but tried to rewrite and work on those things I was trying to actually talk about. And wrote a lot of poems that were very personal, wrote a lot of poems that deal in metaphor, and tried to also look at my relationship with Appalachia, because it's a region that I very much love and value, but it's also a place where I have been hurt. And so the rewriting and all of that took probably 2 to 3 years, but I had been working on it long before then. And I, along the way, started sending individual poems out to be published. So some of them, several of them have been published in different journals and magazines. And then right before the book was ready for, like, final copy edits, 4 or 5 or 6 of them were picked up for the LGBTQ Fiction and Poetry in Appalachia anthology. So that was fantastic, because I was so proud to be a part of that collection. So
that's good.
Yeah, I was excited.
Have you always written poetry, or did you ever write prose?
I have. Poetry has been, like, my first love. I have written a fair amount of creative nonfiction, and I studied nonfiction sort of in undergrad, sort of like in tangent with poetry a little bit. And I have an MFA in poetry, and right now I'm working on essays that they're shaping into a memoir. But I've written some short stories. I love fiction. I probably read as much fiction as I do anything else, or more maybe. But so far I've only been able to manage writing short stories. But I have some ideas for some things that we'll see how they come to fruition. But I work in a couple of different genres. I don't know if I will ever be a successful fiction writer, but I enjoy writing in different genres. It teaches me a lot about poetry, even, to write in another form.
I think the reverse is true too. I think reading poetry informs the language in fiction as well.
Definitely, I think so too. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite poet?
Oh, I have a lot of favorite poets. One of the poets I will always mention is Mary Oliver.
Yeah.
And it's because her work is one of the first ones I encountered as a young writer. Rita Dove, also Nikki Finney, Audre Lorde, Adrienne Rich, but I could go on for days.
Yeah.
So.
Right. There's one poem that I particularly liked, and I can't remember the name of it, but there's one that talked about, I guess you put a metaphor of breast cancer and mountaintop removal together.
Yeah.
Tell me about that one.
So that is one of, it's a poem from the first section. It's a longer poem, actually. And it, one of the sections compares breast cancer to mountaintop removal. And so it uses the language of mountaintop removal to write about breast cancer, but also vice versa. And so part of why I did that, there were two reasons. Coal mining, for the most part, when I grew up, had left my county before I was born. By the time I came along, all the damage had been done. But there was still a lot of mining in the surrounding counties, and my county is where the three forks of the Kentucky River converge. And so cancer rates are ridiculously high, and I think there's a lot of pollution and water damage and things happening to the environment that we're still seeing, even though we haven't had mining in the region or in my town in a long time. Breast cancer runs in my family, and so I think I wanted to write about both topics, and I started looking at just the process of a mastectomy or a lumpectomy, and then also thinking about coal mining, and that's sort of how that poem was, or that part of that poem was born. So
it's a great combination. I really think when you think about the destruction that cancer can do to the body and what particularly mountaintop removal does to our environment, it's a wonderful combination. I think it made great sense. You also talk about body shaming. Talk a little bit about why that's a topic that you chose to write about.
Well, I think that even before I realized I was gay, I was different. I was taller than all the other little kids, at least until I stopped growing and they started growing. I'm not that tall now, but I was a big kid. And I was nerdy. I loved to read, loved to be in my head and play my imagination and all of that. And so I knew that there were things about me that were different. And, you know, kids and people, even not just children, they latch on to the first thing they see. And for me, that was me being bigger than the other kids. And so that was something I had dealt with a lot. And so it was something I knew that if I was going to write this book about self-acceptance and being okay with my sexuality and all of that, part of that would be, you know, writing about my body and that experience. So that was probably one of the harder parts of the book to write.
I was just going to suggest that it probably was, yes. Yeah. So when you're teaching in Kentucky or at Wesleyan, do you encourage the students to write in a similar vein? I mean, to delve into their own experiences to write, or what do you lean on most in your teaching?
I think that you know, I think it depends on the student. I try to the first thing I try to do is validate a student writer's experiences. A lot of times students come to the writing table and they don't think their experiences are valid, or they don't think they're worth writing about. And so I try to help them understand that there's value to that. But I also don't want to force them to write about their own experiences if they're not ready. And so it's finding a balance. Sometimes I'll be working with a writer who is clearly trying to write about themselves, but sort of struggling, or they're pushing to get there and they're not just there. So it's really important to get to know my students and to really see what it is they're trying to accomplish. And also know, where their potential can take them. I've worked with some fantastic students who are writing fiction that have nothing to do with who they are. So it just depends on the student writer. But I think for any of them, even if they're not writing about themselves, I think it's important for them to value their experience and understand that there's value in it.
Right. Let me ask you a question that's kind of a broad topic, but do you think that books can serve a moral purpose, and do you hope that something in your book will reach that point with the reader?
I think that books can serve a moral purpose. I mean, I think there's all kinds of research that shows that reading teaches us empathy. Yeah. It broadens our understanding, whether it's of people just like us or people different from us in whatever way, whether that means they're somewhere else or their experience is different and they live in the same town. So it teaches empathy. I think it can teach us, help us understand other perspectives different from our own. We don't have to necessarily adopt those perspectives as our truth or as our beliefs, but if we don't have understanding of where someone's coming from, then that's what creates such a divide, I think. And I think that people's unwillingness to consider different perspectives is what creates the divide. I think that with my book, my whole purpose was to tell my truth and to be honest, and about what I've experienced. And I think that there are people who have connected with that. So I hope that if there is a moral to the book, it's that there is such value and joy in finding a way to accept yourself.
Right. Yeah, I can see that, and I can see that it would speak to somebody who may be struggling with similar issues and validate them as a person.
Yeah, I really, I think that's one of the things that's been most enjoyable for me as an introvert, particularly in doing readings and all of, classroom visits and stuff, is to see the different things in the book that people connect with. Even people who aren't LGBTQ have, connected with different parts of it. And for me, that's been the most fascinating part, is just to see like what it is that sticks out to other people. But the whole concept of like valuing ourselves as a person, it's not something I think we're taught. And so I think that that's a big thing that people connect with.
Right. I agree. What moves you most in a book? You said you read a lot of fiction. What moves you?
I think, well, a good story, like a good plot. But for me, I think even more than that are characters that I can connect with. And so when I think about my favorite books, fiction or memoir or anything else, I think about, am I connecting with this character's experiences, or even just like their persona, like who they are or their voice. And so that's huge for me. I was trying to think of maybe a really great example. One of my favorite books. It's an LGBTQ book, and it is called Juliet Takes a Breath. And the narrator is from New York and is a teenager, I think 15, 16 maybe, and she realizes she's gay, doesn't know how to tell her family, and basically manages to get this internship for the summer across the country. And so she does that to avoid having to tell her family. But the way that she talks about like the pressure she feels and how she's so worried about telling her family, but also like the dynamic of her family, and because she's a very family-oriented dynamic. But at the same time, she's also sort of having this feminist awakening. Mm-hmm. And so the person she's interning with is this feminist author. And so I just loved so much of that book because it was this story of just like trying to figure out how to be yourself and who you are. But also like having this experience that opens your perspective up. It's really well written. It has a fantastic voice.
That's great.
The character's voice in that book just comes through in a way that is wonderful.
Tell us the title again.
Juliet Takes a Breath.
Okay, that's great. Do you have a favorite of the poems that you've got in your collection?
You know, I mean, there are several I like for different reasons. I think that one of the poems that I love, and I think part of why I love it is because the whole process of writing it and revising it and revising it and revising it, I'm so happy with how it turned out when it was published, is What We Tell Ourselves, which is the longer poem that you referenced a section of.
Right.
And it contains different voices for one, but it started out, I've written so many different versions of this poem, and it was much longer at one point, and I feel like writing it challenged me and helped me learn and grow as a poet. So it's probably one of my favorites.
Wow, that's great. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today. This is about all the time we've got, and I really appreciate you being able to do this. Hopefully we can do it again when the next book you have comes out.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed this.
All righty, thank you. So that'll do it for this time on Chapters, and I hope we'll be able to come back to you the next time from the Inner Geek. If not, it'll be back on the beach again. Thank you so much. This is Carter Seaton, and we'll see you another time.
Connect with Chapters through email. Write to lp4@zoominternet.net. Chapters has a Facebook page at Armstrong Chapters. Like, subscribe, share, and comment. All Chapters episodes are available on YouTube. Visit the Armstrong Neighborhood channel on YouTube and look for a playlist of all the Chapters programs.